Hi everyone. My name is John Hancock, and that's my real name. And I just wanted to start a series of videos for you. I know right now we're having a little bit of a strange moment in time with this coronavirus um, fiasco and this pandemic. Um, but I've started a YouTube channel, and the first three videos that I made were um, just the things that I like to do, playing tennis and uh, jumping off of a high platform into a pool. Um, Actually, my first video was of the apartment fire, the fire that destroyed the apartment where I previously lived. So you can see those three exciting videos on my YouTube channel. But this is a new series that I wanted to begin under the overarching title of The Truth About Psychiatry. Um, and this first episode, I would like to call, um, maybe just call it Cracked, because that's the name of, or the title of a book that I discovered that sort of led me on a path of further discovery. And I want to tell you a little bit briefly about my own story, um, about the eye-opening experience that I had in discovering this book and where that led me, and also um, maybe just a preface to the um, whole series about the truth about psychiatry. Now, the reason I'm doing this is, well, one reason is when people are all in lockdown and um, kind of quarantining themselves, it gives you more time to reflect and to work on other things. I've kept myself busy with work and uh, creating a garden, uh, fixing up my bike, getting it ready so I can ride, stuff like that. So I know there's a lot of concerns out there, legitimate concerns, but there's also a lot we can do. And one of the things we can do is make videos. And I've already watched quite a few videos of people, friends, and I've enjoyed. And I think it's a worthwhile activity if you have something meaningful and positive to share, which we all do. But the main reason I want to start this series of videos about the truth about psychiatry is because um, I want to shed light on on a problem in our society in a way that will be encouraging and helpful to people who are suffering. And throughout this series, I hope that people will keep in mind that preface, because the things that I have to share uh, often run counter to the prevailing or predominant narrative in society about psychiatry and about things such as mental illness. And I'll have much more to say about that. If these are topics that interest you, I'd be interested in your feedback, questions, comments, suggestions, constructive criticism, that kind of thing. So, so yeah, the truth about psychiatry. Um, so some questions that I'll be asking throughout are questions like, what is psychiatry? I'll be asking, what is mental illness? Um, that would include questions like, what is bipolar disorder? What is ADD? What is schizophrenia? What is, let's see, you know, maybe you've heard of the DSM. What is the DSM? Um, and along the way, we'll delve into other questions and um, just briefly my own story. Why did I get interested in this? There are several reasons, some of which I would prefer to share maybe on a more individual basis. Um, but just for a brief summary, about a decade ago, I began searching for answers to the questions that I just posed. Because I was curious, something didn't seem right about the way that things were being explained in the world, in the media, um, the way that people talked about um, suffering, about how people were suffering, and also um, I have known many people who have endured great suffering um, because of what is commonly referred to as mental illness. And I've also had friends and relatives and close acquaintances, um, people who have actually decided to end their lives, and um, a lot of troubling things. So naturally, these kind of experiences start to prompt questions. Like I said, about a decade ago, I began a search. Um, and this search was sparked in part by an experience I had with a friend. A friend and I went to Barnes and Noble one night, the bookstore, and she happened to notice a book that was on the shelf. She pulled it off the shelf and she showed it to me because she knew of my interest in the topic of psychiatry, and she knew that I was searching. And the book that she pulled off the shelf was this one. So James Davies cracked the Unhappy Truth About Psychiatry. So naturally, it's piqued my curiosity because up to that point, I really hadn't read anything substantial on the topic. Um, and so I bought the book, and needless to say, I devoured it because basically it began to provide answers and open my eyes to answers that, and even to questions that I hadn't even considered. Um, so again, as I briefly review this book, and as I delve deeper into this topic throughout these videos, I hope that you'll keep in mind that the reason that I'm doing it is that I sincerely want to help people who are suffering, and I want to shed light so that people have accurate information in order to make their own decisions. Um, I'm fond of something that the prophet Joseph Smith said about his life. Um, for those of you who aren't familiar with Joseph Smith, he was the first prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in modern times. He was the Lord's chosen prophet to restore the gospel of Jesus Christ in its fullness and his church on the earth. And he had a comment about his life experience where he said, basically, if I hadn't have lived it, I wouldn't have believed it myself. So he didn't blame anyone for not believing him. And he actually suffered a lot of persecution because of the plain truth that he told people. And that's kind of the effect that truth sometimes has on people, is it stirs up, so light and truth stir up darkness and often persecution. But I like what Joseph Smith had to say about it, um, and I'm nowhere near his level of what he experienced. But I've had my own experiences, and I would say in the same um, spirit that I don't blame anyone if they don't believe what I say. And if I hadn't have lived through the experience that I've lived through, I probably wouldn't believe it myself. So I like how he said that because it provides a way, a path of forgiveness and a path of basically setting forth the truth as I see it, and allowing people to make their own decisions with the information given. And that's one of the main reasons I want to share, because even for a long time, as I was searching for accurate information, it was very hard to find. And now, after a decade of study, and much more than a decade of experience and study, I can say that the things that I have to share, um, you can search them out for yourself and decide for yourself. Um, so I'm not asking you to take my word for it, but to 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 take what I say and see if you wanted, if it helps in your own search, if you're interested. Um, so briefly, this book that captured my attention and I read very quickly um, is actually by a psychiatrist. So James Davies, and I don't know much about him, and like I said, this was about a decade ago that I actually read this book, because it was one of the first that I read. Um, he he asked some interesting questions, and maybe I'll just find a few passages here that might pique your curiosity. He asks in the early portions of the book, why has psychiatry become the fastest growing medical specialism when it is still has the poorest curative success? Why are psychiatric drugs now more widely prescribed than almost any other medical drugs in history, despite their dubious efficacy? Why does psychiatry, without solid scientific justification, keep expanding the number of mental disorders it believes to exist, from 106 in 1952 to 374 today? What is going on? And these were good questions. These are the kind of questions that I was wondering about. I was wondering why. What's the deal with this? Why does it seem like there's so much expansion in quote unquote mental illness? Why is this anxiety, depression? And I think it's going to be even more and more relevant with this coronavirus pandemic, because I've already noticed articles that are coming out of people claiming that, and not without reason, that there will be a rise in anxiety, depression, and all of these things. I don't like to dwell on those things. I'd rather say sometimes those things are self-fulfilling prophecies. Um, but it's there are there is real suffering in the world, and I'm not oblivious to that. And I've experienced my own trials. So, but these were questions that James Davies was asking, and they were relevant to the questions that I wanted answers to. He goes on to say, many areas of psychiatry have become so lured by power and money that they are in danger of putting the pursuit of pharmaceutical riches and medical status above their patients' well-being. And that's an interesting statement that I think is true for the most part. But there's also some problems with it that I'll discuss in later videos. Let's see. He talks a little bit about the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. and he naturally wonders why it started, as a mere 130 pages in one of the earlier editions to a later edition of over 800 pages. Why? How did that happen? Why this expansion? Um, he even mentions the controversial fact that in the early diagnostic and statistical manual, the one of the disorders listed actually in the DSM-2 was homosexuality. It was actually listed as a mental disease, described as sexual deviation, but it was later removed from the DSM. And Davies has some interesting things to say about that. If you're interested, you might want to pick up a copy of this. It's published in, when was this published? 2013. So, yeah, not quite a decade ago, but almost. So, those are some things that he says in early chapters. I've highlighted a few other things that might be of interest. So, one thing he wonders is that maybe psychiatry has been progressively lowering the bar for what counts as a mental disorder and has recast many natural responses to the problems of living as mental disorders requiring psychiatric treatment. In other words, has psychiatry, by redrawing the line between disorder and normality, actually created the illusion of a pandemic? That's an interesting statement, especially considering we're in a real pandemic now. Is it possible that psychiatry created the illusion of a pandemic? And if so, how? And also, why? A few more things, and maybe I can wrap up this first video because I know my own attention span and the public attention span in the days of Facebook and YouTube is certainly waning. Let's see. More about the DSM. He gets into talking about what he calls happy pills, psychiatric quote-unquote medication, or what is commonly referred to as antidepressants. I'll have a lot more to say about that in future videos, in part because even the word antidepressant is a misnomer, and the word medication is worse than a misnomer. And it's even worse than a euphemism. It's actually a misleading term. But we'll talk about that later. He talks about pharmaceutical companies. But I want to get to some parts later in the book where he starts to introduce some other authors, psychiatrists, and thinkers, one of whom was a woman named Joanna Moncrief. She has a couple books that I've read that we'll get to talk about. Because in the time since I found this book, I've read every single book that I could find on the topic of psychiatry. So I have a whole library shelf of books, not the ones directly behind me, but over here. And we can talk about those if you like. And I'm open to questions, comments, concerns. I would like to hear from you about your thoughts. So he mentions David Oakes, he mentions lithium, talks about neurotransmitters and all those kind of things, and we'll have more to say about that. And then, when I first read this book, I didn't realize how connected this Mr. Davies is. He attained his PhD in social medical anthropology at Oxford, So I suppose he's not a psychiatrist, but he's a researcher, PhD at Oxford in anthropology. But he was really connected, and he sought out some of the best authors who have been writing about this. Here's an interesting statement. On page 152, he says, "What disturbs me, and I suppose what disturbs us all, is when the powerful, in the name of serving others, begin to use their power to serve themselves. This is what enrages us about political expense scandals, or free press abuses, or of private rights, or good old boys networks protecting their own. Call us idealistic or whatever appellation you like, but we are right to feel consternation when people start wielding the privilege of power self-interestedly." And that's a poignant statement with regards to psychiatry, as we'll see throughout these videos. And I personally think it has application to some of what's happening now with the response to coronavirus. He talks about the medical profession, Abilify, Zoloft, Paxil, Prozac, Lexapro, Eli Lilly, the FDA, other drug companies. He says, these inconvenient facts are not generally known, partly because pharmaceutical corporations have promoted misinformation through concealing negative data, through powerful marketing campaigns costing billions of dollars a year, and through conducting research that regularly chops the figures in ways advantageous to company interests. One reason why psychiatry has tolerated this more than it should is because too many doctors, research centers, and researchers, and too many DSM committee members, that is, too many leaders within the psychiatric profession, have had their objectivity compromised by the pharmaceutical funds upon which they have come to depend. That's a good statement, and kind of reminds me of a famous quote. I think it might be Milton Friedman or someone like that said, it's really hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon him not understanding it. He says, biological or pharmaceutically sponsored psychiatry has slowly and perceptibly, but almost assuredly, begun to alter the way in which many of us now manage, respond to, and experience emotional discontent. Then he has a chapter called The Psychiatric Myth, where he introduces some more important historical figures and thinkers, but I can't share everything from it, but I do want to take note of a couple of authors that he mentions. And when I first read the book, I had no idea who these authors were, but now that I've read this book, then I've also read the authors that he mentions. One of the authors is a guy named Ethan Waters. He's an investigative writer, and he basically tried to figure out, not only what was going on in America with the way we talk about mental health and things like that, but how America has actually succeeded in exporting its framework for thinking about suffering. So that's a very interesting book. Let me see if I can find it. Yes, and we'll probably talk about this book later, but he has a book called Crazy Like Us, and it's a really interesting read. So Ethan Waters is one. He mentions Edward Shorter, who is one of the probably most widely read historians of psychiatry. But now that I've read Shorter's works, there are some major problems with what he has written. Now, after Water, Shorter, I want to get to someone that's in later videos I'll probably talk about much more extensively. But James Davies actually met with this man soon before he died, and I'm trying to find the exact page because I'm actually very impressed that he met this guy and was able to have a conversation with him so soon before his death. Let's see. Oh, I should mention he does also mention Peter Breggin, who has a wonderful quotation here that I'd like to read. So first I'll read about Breggin, and then I'll tell you about the man that Davies met with. Breggin said, "People who are breaking down are often like canaries in a mine shaft," explained Breggin. "They are a signal of a severe family issue, and sometimes the one who is breaking down is being scapegoated. Sometimes they're the most sensitive, creative member of the family, or sometimes they're the one person in the family with a really different personality. You don't know what is going on often, but with work you can see the dynamics that have developed in the family that are pulling things down." And then Davies goes on to say, "For Breggin, because the medical model fails to take context seriously, whether the family or the wider social context, it overlooks the importance of understanding and managing context to help the person in distress." So that passage really stood out to me early on in my exploration. And the man that James Davies met and spoke with, that I will spend a lot of time talking about in later videos, is a man by the name of Professor Thomas Szasz. Davies mentions that Szasz is one of the most influential critical psychiatrists of the 20th century, and he's an author of a book called, well, he's an author of many books, but one of his most famous books was called The Myth of Mental Illness. And we'll discuss that book in some detail. So Davies quotes Szasz in this conversation that he has with Szasz, and he says, "My understanding of emotional suffering," answered Szasz in considered tones, "and I hope I won't be misunderstood, is no different from the traditional understanding of the Jews, Christians, or Muslims of emotional suffering. Suffering is life. God didn't put us on this earth, assuming that he did, to be happy. Life, as I put it humorously, is not a picnic. It makes no difference if you are a king or a pope or a tyrant." So Szasz has some provocative ways of writing, and I don't agree with him about everything. Suffering is definitely a part of life, but I don't think that it is life. I think we are put here to have joy, and suffering is part of the process of learning how to experience joy. But Szasz goes on to say, "In one sentence, and my statement is not original, our age has replaced a religious point of view with a pseudoscientific point of view. Now everything is explained in terms of molecules and atoms and brain scans. It is a reduction of the human being to a biological machine. We don't have existential or religious or mental suffering anymore. Instead, we have brain disorders, but the brain has nothing to do with it, except that it is an organ necessary for thinking." So again, Szasz has some provocative ways of writing, and I think there's a lot of truth to what he's saying. There are some things that I disagree with, but his observation about changing from a religious viewpoint to a pseudoscientific viewpoint is definitely something worth discussing in future videos. So Davies was familiar with Szasz, and he says, "Sadly, a month after I interviewed Szasz, he died in his home in Syracuse. He was 92. I was probably the last person to have interviewed him, but among what must have been some of his closing words on psychiatry, he leaves us with the following statements. which I summarize. It was hubris for medicine to try and manage realms of life for which it was never designed to treat. It had become deluded in its belief that its physical technologies, its electroshock machines, and laboratory manufactured molecules could solve the deeper dilemmas of the soul, society, and self. Professional grandiosity had blinded both the industry and a growing public to psychiatry's serious philosophical and technical limitations, and this had been compounded by the demise of traditional systems of meaning that once provided alternative solutions to the riddles of human despair. So, um, that was a curious thing that I read this, 7 years ago, and first encountered SAWS in a book by James Davies, um, and also Peter Breggin, and Joanna Moncrief. The conclusion of Davies' books, he says, I believe that psychiatry is not the enemy, that the people I have disagreed with are not the enemy. No, I believe the only enemy is anything that actively tries to conceal the inconvenient facts. And the good news is that today in psychiatry, the cell of concealment is cracking. The truths are finally seeping out. As to what role you choose to play in furthering this seepage is naturally a matter for you alone. But insofar as I have succeeded in making what is not generally known more freely available, then I have to admit it is with a lighter heart that I finally bring this book to a close and bid you good night. I like that. He was trying to bring to light some truth about psychiatry, and I think James Davies cracked the unhappy truth about psychiatry, and I think he really succeeded, and really helped me in the beginning of my journey towards opening my eyes to what was going on. So yeah, that's probably enough for the first video, an introduction to the series that I want to continue on, the truth about psychiatry, and this first episode called Cracked. So we've talked a little bit about James Davies, the people that he met, the questions that he asked, some of the history of psychiatry, and that can serve as a good introduction. So at the conclusion of this first video, I would just want to ask you, what do you think? Do you have any questions? Do you have any thoughts or ideas? And maybe I'd invite you to find this book. There are going to be a lot more that we can talk about, but I just invite you to consider the things that I've talked about, and maybe I'll provide some links at the bottom of the page to books and articles as we go along. But anyhow, thanks for listening if you made it this far, and thanks for listening to part one of the Truth About Psychiatry, episode 1, Cracked.